for my career, I think this would be a great story to tell. It's a good founding journey. There are interesting lessons that I might be able to pull for a future job. And for my family, we made the calculation that this is a financial risk we could take for this period of time. But if you're not in that position, it makes it very difficult. If you can't take that leap and say, okay, I'm okay with failing right now, then it's going to be very hard to do. So I think that's like a key part of the personal journey that you need to sort of reckon with before you start to found something.
Karthik is the founder of Rising Tide, where they're using the power of real-world data and AI to match underserved psychiatric patients to clinical trials, all in hospitals' EMR in real time. Beyond that, Karthik is one of our closest friends, and it was a blast learning about his founding journey and talking about everything from speed dating for co-founders to deep dives into how clinical trials work. We're excited to share this episode with you today. Enjoy.
We're gonna actually push for fundraising later in February, but we have all so much to do before we actually start.
And this would be a seed round.
Pre-seed probably. I don't think we're raising enough yet. We're not planning to raise enough to be seed.
Yeah, it's funny how a lot of the goalposts have shifted for raising money.
I know it's kind of bullshit whatever seed versus pre-seed really means, but yeah, it is what it is.
What does it mean? I've actually I haven't actually raised. I've been on the other side of raising, but...
So what I have been told, and don't quote me on this, is that a pre-seed is typically under 2 million raise, but that's a very kind of squishy target because sometimes it can be based on not how much you're raising, but based on the valuation of the company. Mm-hmm. So when you're raising under 2, they like to call it a pre-seed these days.
Is seed a priced round? Still nowadays, or only?
Yeah, no, it can be. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The other thing is what I'm seeing and what I've been surprised about is that with seed rounds, there can very much be an expectation of revenue already, whereas pre-seed they allow you to be very early, like several months from revenue, and we have some kind of internal milestones to hit before we get there. Right now, we have a prototype in development that is working pretty well, but what we haven't done is actually deploy it natively onto medical record software. So it's kind of a standalone application right now, just so we can demo it essentially when we're talking to investors. But if we actually want to go to a hospital and pilot it, it needs to be able to be integrated within their EHR software. And that is a huge lift. And doing that in a month is insane, but we probably have to do that. So that's been the big hiccup.
I'm just going to quickly share Rising Tide, which is the company. You shared us your website. So maybe just tell us a little bit about what y'all are working on.
Yeah, we kind of dove in without actually talking about sort of the company as it is. So the short story of what we're working on is a technology that will use patients' data to match them to a clinical trial. Now, that's like a very, very elementary way of describing it. But ultimately, what we're trying to work on is a problem related to widespread recruitment of patients to clinical trials. The issue is most patients are basically, they're recruited from academic hospitals in big cities, and that tends to be a very narrow group of patients that are available to clinical trials. Outside of that, the process to find patients for clinical trials is very manual. They literally, in a lot of cases, send out nurses or nurse practitioners to other hospitals with a clipboard and have them review patient charts to find who might be eligible for a trial. There is some degree of automation with that these days, but not as much as you would expect. It's actually still fairly manual. And what that's created is an issue where a lot of clinical trials are extremely demographically homogenous. So you get, across all diseases, roughly 75% of participants in clinical trials in the US are Caucasian. And so drugs are getting approved with really unexpected effects in, demographic groups that are unstudied in clinical trials. This happened with the COVID vaccine very famously, and it actually spurred the FDA to act. What happened with the COVID vaccine is, understandably, because they were moving so fast, they recruited who they could get, and it didn't include any like younger people, and it didn't include certain demographic groups like Korean people that had negative effects to both the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines that were unexpected. And then the J&J vaccine had cardiac events in teenage boys, all of which would have been understood had those people been purposely recruited out to the clinical trial. And this keeps happening in disease after disease. Now in COVID, it's kind of a unique situation because of how fast those had to go. But what the FDA did last year is, after many years of sort of debating the right approach and issuing provisional rules, they issued a final guidance which requires, with every pivotal trial, which is to say a trial that is submitted for approval to the FDA, you have to submit a diversity action plan, which means how are you going to recruit the right ratio of patients that will accurately predict how this drug is going to perform in the real world. But in order to do that, you actually have to reach patients where they are. So what we are trying to do is, in a privacy-preserving way, integrate into the electronic health record systems at any hospital, but we're targeting some of these underserved rural and suburban hospitals, and ingest all of the clinical data for their patients, and then match that clinical data against the eligibility criteria for a clinical trial, and then present that trial recommendation to the doctor all within the EHR software so that they don't need to leave it. And then they can act on it however they want. They can refer the patient to the trial. They can, do nothing. They can educate the patient on exactly what the trial is and what their options are, et cetera, et cetera. So we leave that to the doctor after the actual recommendation is presented. There's a lot that goes into that, obviously, but on the front end, it's extremely simple. It's just a module that's built into an EHR.
Dream here would be, I'm a doctor, I'm sitting with the patient, I enter the patient's, the patient's information pops up for me, but I'm entering what I think they're presenting. And then the software would tell me, hey, given what you think this patient has and what other drugs you're prescribing, there's actually a trial available for this patient. You should go check out whether or not you want to introduce the patient into this trial. And then they would decide yes or no. Is that kind of the way you would think about it?
That's exactly right. So the critical thing is that there's pre-existing information in the health record, right? Like all of the previous visits the patient has had to that hospital, to that doctor, there's data associated with it. They had this cardiac event, or they had this blood pressure, et cetera, all documented in their medical record. That's documented as structured information, right? It's easily processable ahead of the appointment. During the appointment, to your point, the doctor's entering in information to the health record, either as notes, like unstructured data, or they're filling in fields within the health record. Usually that's not what they're doing, though. We're trying to use both of those sources of information. I mentioned earlier that, there exists some automation to clinical trial matching today. Where it exists, the way it uses data is only structured data. Things like the prescriptions a patient has had in the past, how many visits they have had with the doctor, their height, weight, blood pressure, things like that. Things that are discrete and measurable and writable within certain fields in the EHR software. But when it comes to like free text notes, they're not used at all. And they actually contain way more clinical information than the traditional EHR fields do. The important thing there is, in a lot of clinical trials, it's that information that will allow you to match to the clinical trial. And I'll explain why we start with psychiatry, because it's a particular case where this happens a lot. But what we're trying to use is both the real-time captured data, the unstructured data during the appointment, as well as prior captured structured data.
Maybe you could give us like this is super, super interesting, by the way, especially how it ties in. And something that sort of gave me a bit of a visceral reaction is how it ties into the COVID, how it tied into the COVID vaccine as an example. Maybe you can give us a bit of an origin story of how did you sort of decide this was something you wanted to spend, essentially all your time on? And how did you meet your founder or your co-founder? And how did it all?
Yeah, the personal journey. Yeah. So prior to this, I was working for 3-ish years at a startup called Holmusk. And what I was the VP of BizOps there. And what we worked on was a data solution, not so dissimilar from this, where we would digest clinical data from health records software and aggregate that and then sell that data as a database to pharma for research purposes, because that real world data is a kind of invaluable source of information for research purposes, for drug discovery, for health economics research that they might want to do, things like that. So it's a very tried and true model. There's tons of companies that do it. We were first movers in psychiatry specifically. What we saw there was a lot of pharma companies that we were working with were asking us, can we use this data to find patients for clinical trials? And there wasn't a clean way of doing that without uncovering the patient's identity. And so the way that our technology worked, it was very difficult. I wouldn't say impossible, but it was like untenable to actually do that in a privacy preserving manner. And so we couldn't. And prior to that, I was working on oncology trials when I was in management consulting for a long time. And we saw similar issues with patient recruitment where these companies I was working with just didn't hit their quota on finding patients in time, and it would just delay the trials. There was one launch that I worked on for a cancer drug that was 1.5 years delayed just for one of the cancer areas that it was trying to get approved. And so that pushed everything out by years and years. And that was just because they couldn't find enough patients. And so it's just a theme that I kept seeing again and again. And so I just...
So in multiple prior lives, essentially, this was an issue, right? Both at Holmusk, but then also in times when you...
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's an industry-wide problem. I just happen to work in spaces where both the scientific, the clinical impact of it and the commercial impact of it were very obvious. And so I just wanted to work on that problem. My academic background is I did research for a long time. And so I'm coming from someone that has an interest in the clinical research part of things. Coming out of grad school, I worked in psychiatry research. And so I wanted to double down on this space and work at something that was sort of at the bridge between the scientific part of the organization in pharma and the commercial part of the organization, which is transitioning drugs from clinical trial to commercial product. So, yeah, I had this idea when I was at Holmusk, and it wasn't something we could do there. On top of that, the company itself wasn't doing great. And so last year I got laid off early in the year. And so I decided that was actually a perfect time for me to start this. It was like a good opportunity to just transition to something that I'd already been sort of batting around and putting the initial plans to. So that led me to where I am now. So I've been working on it in earnest for probably truly like 6 or 7 months, but I had been working on sort of the idea for longer than that. And then in terms of finding my co-founder, this was actually really the hardest part. And I have so many thoughts and advice to future founders on this. So I am a non-technical founder in the sense that while I have a scientific background, I don't have an engineering background. And so all of my actual career experience is either in clinical research or in the commercial side of pharma and digital health. So I needed to find someone that could help me actually build this product. And finding technical founders is very difficult because usually the technical founders are themselves founding a company and already have an idea and are looking for non-technical founders. It's rarer, it's not completely rare, but it is rarer to find a non-technical founder looking for a technical founder. So, I mean, one of the first things I did is this is a really nice thing, and I'm sure this exists in the Bay too, but in New York, the startup ecosystem is really friendly and like extremely helpful when you're looking for stuff. And there's like all these different networking WhatsApp groups you can join. And literally every day there's like a founders coffee, investors happy hour, things like that. And I was going to a ton of these for like months as soon as I started. And I kept meeting people who would refer me to other people who would refer me to other people. And I essentially treated it like speed dating. Like I went through people that I felt like might be a fit. And then, it didn't really work out for one reason or another. And then I discovered that Y Combinator actually has a co-founder matching program, which works very similar to a dating app. You literally click left, click right on people as you go through reading their profiles.
Really? You're actually swiping on people?
You're not swiping because it's literal clicking, but yes, I mean, it's exactly how it works. It's really smart, actually.
What's the like information they're showing you? Like in a dating app, they'd be like, I'm this tall and, whatever, I like these sports or whatever. Like, what are they doing in this app?
It's actually so interesting. You can actually write as much or as little as you want.
Are you able to do this? Is random. Can you pull it up?
Give me a second. I can show it to you.
Yeah, I think you should have a share screen button there somewhere.
Yeah.
It's like a whole dating ecosystem I had no idea existed.
It's I basically...
What if someone was trying to look for a co-founder, but then they actually found like their life partner?
That's so funny. I was joking with Neha that like it's been 15 years since I've needed to date, but now I have to. And she was like,
We co-founded a family together.
Yeah.
You
okay,
Yeah, because
so
a lot of people don't understand how hard it is in the early days to find someone who's interested, but then also take the risks.
Honestly, I was super curious about this. I never knew how this worked. It's like you have an idea and then you're like, do I just need to know the person who I'm going to start it with already?
Sometimes I think you do, but then a lot of times you might not know anyone who's interested in the same thing.
I have bad news, guys. Chrome wants me to log out and log in to make
Oh, it's fine. Don't worry. We can find it later.
Anyways, so on that, I basically made a very detailed profile. And I mean, why don't I just describe the things while
Yeah, if you could talk about it.
Yeah. So the things you put in are basically like basic information about yourself. You make a casual introduction about yourself is what they encourage you to write, something that covers both your professional and personal life. Then things like what is your most impressive professional achievement, things like that. And then you describe if you are if you're a founder that is looking for a co-founder, you describe your business idea in detail, and they ask a lot of questions about it. And then you publish that profile, and people will either reach out to you or you can reach out to people. So once you accept a specific profile, you can message them. So I was just doing that. I was messaging tons of people with like a data science background, a healthcare data science background, or, machine learning engineering background. And I got a lot of interesting leads through that. But I finally met my current co-founder. His name is Kanoa through that. So actually he found me through that. He messaged me and we kind of hit it off from there and have been working together ever since.
And when was that?
October.
So pretty recent. Yeah.
It's pretty recent, yeah. And prior to that, I had a different guy that had sort of signed on to be my co-founder, but he had told me, been transparent with it, that he was also working on his own business idea, but was kind of de-risking in the sense that like he didn't know if it was going to pan out. And so he wanted to potentially explore other opportunities. So ultimately he actually went back to working on that, and I kind of knew, so it wasn't that big of a deal, but it did delay me. So I otherwise would have found someone, I think, a couple of months earlier.
Can I, on the personal journey side, like when you left your previous company and were thinking about, okay, I can do this startup, I have this idea, or there's the whole universe of other established companies that I can go into. How did you think about, where you were in your life, where you were in your career, against the opportunity that you had there, and decide that this was the time to do it?
This has honestly been the most interesting part of the journey. When I told my family that I was going to do this, I think they were all extremely supportive, but they were also like jaw drop, because when I decided this, I was a month away from having a baby. And so they were like, are you sure you want to be, having a newborn and building a company? At the same time, when I was talking to Neha about it, and for people listening, that's my wife, we felt like this was potentially the only or last opportunity where I could take this degree of risk, financial risk, for like sort of a predefined amount of time before it becomes too risky, given that we have 2 kids and there's going to be more and more expenses the older they get. And I think that really made the decision for me. Like, Dhruv is starting preschool this fall, and I just wanted to make sure that whatever I do will take off before that. And so it was sort of the only time I could do it. So in terms of the risk associated with taking a leap like that, it was the last possible time. And Neha was like very encouraging to do it. I think the other thing is, I have the energy now, and I'm not sure that I will in the future. I mean, Vivek, you would know this with 2 kids, and it's very tiring. And I think that the longer it goes, the harder it'll be. And all things considered, given the tech ecosystem that I'm trying to enter, I'm on the older side for starting a company. Like, my co-founder is 28, so he's like much younger than I am, but it makes sense for him where he is in life, right? And so again, it was sort of the last possible time for me to do it, and that's what pulled the trigger for me. It was like, if I didn't do it now, I'm not going to do it. And I had this idea. I knew there was market potential in it. My background is well suited to start it. So I was just like, if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out, and I can go back to work then, but I'll have something interesting to say about what I spent my last year and a half doing, trying to start a company.
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating you mentioned that, because honestly, if you look at, I think maybe the age, there's definitely some reporting out there on this, but my guess is that over time, the age for founders has probably gone down. like
Oh yeah.
in terms of like what age people are starting companies at. But I think that there was some stat that I heard where the average age of a founder when founding a company that ended up with a really positive exit was like actually how old we are now and into 40. Because I think like there's a lot of people who decide to jump into companies when they're very risk tolerant without thinking of the risk of like
Yeah.
what it is, without having an idea for how it's going to go well and how it's going to exit. Versus if you're starting a company at our age or even a little bit older, you're pretty sure that there's a market idea here, and
Yeah.
you're pretty sure that you almost have a bigger fire under your ass to go do it. I would be, wouldn't over index on the age thing. And also honestly, like once the kids are a little older, like for me, now that Gia's 3 and 3 plus and is out of that phase of like needing constant attention and, sleep issues and all that stuff, I think things actually get a lot easier. I mean, not to tell you that. What I'm saying is like, let's say the startup goes really well, which is the hope. I wouldn't be too worried about it, even if it continues for 5 years from now, right? Like, or 10 years from now. And that's how long it takes to build a really, really successful company.
I mean, I think there's so much to what you're saying. I think one of the things that is sort of nice about starting a company at this age is it's sort of the right balance of risk tolerance with like conservativeness about risk. Like there are things that I know I have to take a leap on and that I'm willing to take a calculated risk associated with it. There's other things that I think if I was younger and starting a company, I might do, but it would be a coin flip as to whether it's going to let my company succeed or completely fail. And so I think, that appetite is good when you're younger, I think, because it's like it weeds out bad ideas and really lets good ideas thrive. But I think at this age, it allows me to be a first-time founder at an older age with, starting a company and getting this off the ground with the right balance of risk, I think. We'll see.
And
if
also,
that's
I think
actually true.
one caveat to add is that we're actually phenomenally lucky that our, even at our age and where we are in life, like we've all found life partners who are really great, and B, like have, found life partners who are also working and can kind of help you bridge that a little bit. Like imagine that, I'm just thinking back to the days when, my dad was, when I was coming up and my dad was kind of the sole breadwinner in the house.
Yeah.
In many ways. And he had a lot of entrepreneurial spirit and wanted to do things and ended up doing startups and everything. But that was a lot harder on our family.
Yeah.
Given that he was the primary earner in the house. And so like, I think in maybe it's our generation or maybe the way of life that we have, at least amongst us and our close friends, where we found someone and, we have support from a money standpoint on a month-to-month basis. I think it's actually pretty remarkable. A lot of the stories you hear of people who are starting companies even older, like don't have that sort of foundational level of support.
Yeah.
That I think is pretty awesome that some of us have that. So
Yeah, I mean, really more on that personal journey part. Like one of the things that Neha and I agreed on when I started this was we set a timeline for ourselves and we said, if this doesn't pan out by like late this year, essentially, then I'll turf it and go to work, like apply for jobs. We did a calculation essentially based on her salary and where she is at her law firm. What can we afford essentially for the next, at that time, a year and a half. And it made sense that actually we should do it now because we could take that risk. And she was willing to support me in doing that. And I think, I mean, it is amazing that we have partners like that would support you and are willing to sort of take this, like shoulder the burden for the family for that period of time. But I also think setting a time limit on that makes it more tolerable for the family as a whole, because you say, okay, if at that period of time I don't get it, I'm going to go back to work. It feels like you've taken the risk out of the equation. Like it is of course disappointing if it doesn't work out, but by then you should know if it's going to work out or not. And so it felt like a realistic timeline, and I have that support to do it for that period of time.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking to Helena Merck about this on a previous episode, and she was like a really both early founder and then left something previously to go do something in climate now. And I think it's interesting to think about when the idea also meets your experience and it pulls you to say like, okay, I actually have the perfect Venn diagram here of knowing this is a problem. I know I can fix it with my co-founder. I'm in the right place in my life. Like there's all these things that have to come together. So for it to be like, okay, I have to give a little bit on my energy level, or like I have to put in a little more right now. Probably there's always going to be some trade-off like that you're going to have to make. And I don't think it's that common to be identify such a market gap where you also feel it's an important thing for you to solve. It's not just like a frivolous idea. It's like, I think you feel passionately this is a thing that needs to get corrected too. And so I think there's like sometimes there's a pull also, right, from the thing itself that you can't shut down.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that this would have bugged me forever if I didn't do anything about it. It's like a really big problem, and I think not enough people are trying to solve it, surprisingly.
Well, you guys are going to go pitch sometime soon, probably in the next month or month and a half, be pitching VCs and investors. So have you thought at all about like, what is the size of the problem? Like, what's the TAM?
Yeah. So this is actually a good opportunity for me to describe why we're focused on psychiatry. So our market at launch would be just the psychiatry drug world. And so I could give you the TAM for that. But
What are the examples of the types of drugs people are developing for this?
there's like antipsychotics, like AbbVie, which is a big pharma company, just launched a what's known as an atypical antipsychotic called Vraylar a couple of years ago, which is going gangbusters. Like, it's a really popular drug, and it's one of the first new drugs for schizophrenia, essentially psychotic disorders, in a long time, like one that is as effective as it is. The whole psychiatry market as a whole is historically one that has not had a lot of drug development for a long period of time, because neuroscience as a general field didn't really take off until the early 2000s. And now we are catching up in terms of drug development. So it's like the second or third fastest growing areas for drug development. Cancer, as always, is first. So that is like reason number one, is we want to focus on an area where there's a lot of development. And this is an area where there's a ton of drugs that are coming down the pipeline right now that are in phase 1 and early phase 2 that will need a solution like this. The second thing is, it actually happens to be the area in medicine with the most unstructured data possible. Like, you can imagine a psychiatrist or a psychologist that is treating a patient is taking notes, right? At most psychotherapy visits, and even if it's not like a psychotherapy visit, say it's like a medication consult with a psychiatrist, they're still taking notes because they need to know factors about your life, what's happening with your spouse, what's happening with your kids, that wouldn't otherwise be like written into a medical record. And so that's all captured as free text. All of that data is actually really important for matching patients to clinical trials. And the way that it's actually parsed right now is manually. Like, they have people that literally read charts. It's called chart review. They go through it and they pick out the information that might adhere to certain clinical trial eligibility criteria. And then they will say, hey, patient X is eligible for this trial. This is why the solution right now is not really scalable, why they're not finding patients outside of academic hospitals. So it was both a a faster developing drug area and an area with a huge unmet need and a lot of data that we could play with. And then frankly, the third is that I know a lot about the space. I did research in the space. I worked in the space right before in the digital health field in psychiatry. And so I just happened to bring more knowledge. And so it gave me some confidence that I knew how to launch a product in this particular arena. So if you... Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. No, go.
No.
Keep it. Okay, I was going to ask, from the drug developer side of things,
yeah,
is there a lack of patients that's pushing them into wanting a solution? Like, or is this a market mostly made to solve a problem on the patient side for trial accessibility and for the doctor side? But how do you get the drug developer side to feel like it's valuable to get a diversity of patients?
Couple things. One is the FDA made it a requirement, right? So they have a fire lit under them to actually address this problem. The second thing is there's what's known as phase 4 trials, which is a post-approval real-world study where they set up trial sites at different hospitals and they collect data as patients are actually getting treated with the drug. And increasingly what you find is phase 4 studies disagree with phase 3 studies, which are pre-approval. So you have phase 4 studies that are post-launch, that are collecting real-world data about real patients being treated with this drug that are very diverse, right? Like, they're not 75% Caucasian, they're 30% Caucasian, 20% South Asian or something like that. And they are having to explain that discrepancy in major forums, like major conferences where they present data like this. They have to explain this if they go for any follow-on approvals to the FDA. Oftentimes, drugs aren't approved just for one disease, they're approved for multiple. And so they'll have to explain that too. So they have motivation to do it. They just haven't had a good solution for it before. And now it exists. The other thing is a lot of drug development gets farmed out to what are known as CROs, clinical research organizations. And they historically have sold pharma on having solutions for patient recruitment. But diversity has not been a primary factor in that. It's really been about hitting quota, so getting as many people as possible to join trials. But now that the FDA has said, hey, you guys actually have to do this and submit this with your trial, they have a added motivation as vendors to pharma to solve that. And so pharma wants to do something about it. Last summer, I did a lot of interviews with folks that work in clinical development in pharma. And they basically said, we have no ideas on what to do, or we have ideas, it's going to be too expensive to implement. And we're looking for something like this. So there exists a market need. And because the FDA has created a market for me, it's a good time to kind of leap into it.
What if any impact does the new administration have on all this stuff? Because
great question.
The recent, it's been 24 hours almost since the inauguration. And one of the first things was like, I don't know if this falls under the scope of like a DEI thing. It shouldn't, in my opinion. Yeah. But like, all the DEI related measures, at least for hiring people in the federal government, have essentially been canceled. Does that have an impact on this stuff? Like, how does the FDA get impacted? What is RFK going to do?
It's a really good question. And it's hard for me to know. I really kind of wish they didn't name it Diversity Action Plans. It is an accurate name, but I think that branding alone might mean that they do something to the program. That said, this is also one of those things that's sort of baked in now. Like, this didn't just get decreed last June. It was years in the making. They had followed a very slow and very long rulemaking process where they proposed draft guidance years ahead, actually even before COVID. And then COVID really accelerated the program because they saw this problem coming up a lot. So it isn't, if you actually go and read the guidance, there's a lot of, the entire thing is about the scientific justification for it. The reason you want this is you want your trials to be statistically more representative of your population. And so there isn't a good reason for them to actually rescind it. They might. I don't know what they're going to do. They haven't said anything about it. I've been kind of on top of that.
Very meaningful to you to know about it if they do.
Yeah, I will say pharma is actually sort of on board with it too because of the phase 4, phase 3 discrepancy I was mentioning before. It's becoming like such a big problem and they all want to find other patients. And so they may not like the requirement from the FDA, and maybe there's a part of it that they will lobby against to make it looser, but that would be fine. We'll see. There's definitely a bit of a risk for the business opportunity based on that.
Where do you think you guys would fit into like the value chain in terms of making money? Like, who would you be charging money to for the software, and how would is like a % of the fee for running a trial or something like that?
Yes. So the way that it would work is pharma would be our customer, and the hospital that you work with to ingest the clinical data from, they would be our partners. The commercial model that we are proposing is pharma pays us a fee, what's known already in the market as a site identification fee, for every hospital site that we identify that may have an eligible patient for a clinical trial. There's sort of an industry standard for how that works and how much you get paid. In psychiatry, that's somewhere between $2,500 and $4,000 per patient. Now, you don't actually pay on a per patient basis. There's sort of a flat fee based on the expected volume of patients from a given site, but that's what it boils down to if you actually did the division. And then we would share a certain percentage of that revenue with the hospital so they have a monetary incentive to join our ecosystem, essentially. That is the way the payments sort of flow. There's an additional potential thing that we are debating about a subscription fee for access to the full database, kind of like what I was doing at Holmesk, where the data is itself very useful. Mm-hmm. So if we can monetize that data as a secondary revenue stream that actually might be more predictable in terms of recurring revenue, it would be nice to backstop the site identification fee, which is like the main part of the business. We're thinking about that. That does make the contractual agreement with the hospital, a little more complex. But we will figure that out. That's sort of the payment model right now.
And what, sorry, not to, just to go back to it, what were you saying for the, at least for the psychiatry side of things, what's sort of the TAM that investors should keep in mind?
So it's somewhere around $4 to $5 billion in terms of the TAM, just in psychiatry.
Yeah.
But
then once you're in, you have the hospital partnerships and you're integrated with EHRs.
We can do multiple areas. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to be very intentional with how I build the business and go indication by indication. The important indication means like the disease area. The important thing is there's a possibility, and we're trying to work through this now, that your algorithm needs to be customized to the indication that you're working with, because there are lots of disease specific terms and expected things that you would see in the unstructured data that you may not see in another area. So like what you build for psychiatry may not work well in rheumatology. We don't know that for sure, but that's our hypothesis. So in terms of expanding to other indications, that is the growth for the company, right? Like we can sort of infinitely expand into newer and newer indications, but the amount of work that is required to do that is a little bit of an uncertainty still.
Is there any reason that this happens in research hospitals right now? Like, is there anything the doctor needs to know from a training perspective to follow up on a trial and make sure they're collecting all the right data? And if you add a lot of new doctors entering the system from areas that weren't previously like in trial vicinity, will they need some infrastructure built around them to help them?
Yeah, definitely. So if you are a doctor, okay, so actually your question had two parts. One was about why does it happen at research hospitals? And then the other is, what infrastructure does a doctor need in order to like successfully execute on a trial, or like successfully refer a patient to a trial and track them? You do need some degree of infrastructure. And actually one of the big problems today is none of these sort of community hospitals have any infrastructure as it pertains to trials. And what you need is, number one, an easy way for the doctor to get educated on the trial. So someone to call up and be like, hey, I know about this trial. What is the most local trial site for me? Can I meet with your nurse practitioners that might be running the eligibility determination for the trial? Things like that. None of that really exists. The second thing is an easy way to actually find trials to begin with. Right now, the way that this is done, again, is quite manual. You go to clinicaltrials.gov, which all of us have access to, and you literally just type in the search box, non-small cell lung cancer trial, and you look for all of the ones, and then you search through record by record for each trial and find which ones might apply to your patient. The infrastructure that you need then is things that make all of that a lot simpler, and a person from the pharma company that is easily accessible that can answer your questions. We're addressing that first part. I'm hoping that when we work with our pharma partners or the CROs that they are outsourcing the trial to, that they will provide more resources in terms of, educational resources for the doctors, a nurse or some other staffer that they can call easily. They have all of those things available. They're just really, they are assigned to these academic research institutions. And so you need a lot of that infrastructure, and some of it needs to be deployed directly to these rural areas or suburban areas. Other things can be done remotely. And so we're hoping that automating it gives them the infrastructure for the search and the match to the trial, and then pharma as our partners might be able to backfill the other stuff. In terms of why it happens at the academic research hospitals, there's a few reasons. The first is it's historically just where the academic research happens, right? And academic research is where drugs have come out of and where the drug industry really started. A lot of these famous drug companies that you've heard of, like Genentech or Roche or Novartis, Pfizer, J&J, a lot of their very early products came out of university research. And so it was really easy for those early clinical trials to just be done at academic hospitals attached to medical schools that were doing this research. So it just stuck there. The other thing is the doctors there have a financial interest in completing clinical trials because part of their compensation is the research endeavors that they participate in and publish. And all of these clinical trials are published in peer-reviewed journals. And so it's really important to them to participate in these things. So it just sort of entrenched the clinical trial infrastructure at these hospitals, but there's no actual other reason that they need to only happen at these hospitals. It just is, it's where the money is and where it's historically been, and they just haven't, it's just inertia, essentially.
What have you, like, you've been at it for almost a year now, right? Like, just at least from the early part of the idea, like maybe closer to 8 months or 9 months, what are some interesting things that you've observed or learned that maybe you didn't expect?
Good question. I'm actually surprised, number one, at the speed at which people reacted to the FDA announcement and wanted a solution to this. Like, usually things in healthcare take a really long time. Like, the FDA will issue guidance, and then it'll take like 2 years for anyone to react to it. But with this thing, immediately people were sort of scrambling and being like, how am I going to do this? And I think that kind of underscores the severity of the problem, because there was like literally no real plan to address it. That was like my biggest learning from all of these conversations that I did with potential partners, potential customers, like folks in pharma, was just like, they don't have good ideas and they're really stressed about finding a solution to the problem. The other thing is sort of, I think, broader about like fundraising and starting a startup and stuff like that, is not really specific to this idea. I was sort of surprised at how do I say this?
Yeah.
It's very sort of informal and there isn't real structure to it. You kind of do what you want in terms of raising money and who you talk to. Obviously, everyone says it's entirely based on networking, and it very much is, but the lack of structure to the actual process of raising money was surprising to me. I assumed that there was like a process that people followed and a strategy that made sense. And there are certain strategies for fundraising, and we'll follow one, but I definitely was surprised at how loose it is. It's like just like set up calls with all of these VCs and like generate FOMO between them and fundraise. That's what it is. And that was really interesting to me. In one way, it's nice because it sort of means that I can define the process for myself. But in another way, I think that it makes it really difficult if you are a first-time founder, right? Like knowing where to start and where to take off. Like, at what point am I ready to actually fundraise is a really difficult question to answer if you've never done it and there's no structure to the process. And so I think that
there's a lot of personal, like there's like a lot of personal things involved as well, right? Like, for example, been talking to a startup recently that, like, the founder, basically former founder of another company, is super well off, not taking any real like money from institutional investors, is able to kind of bootstrap, versus an average person who maybe doesn't have that level of, and honestly, like, fundraising in this, it means you're giving up pieces of your company and value. When I started in startups, I always thought that, oh yeah, it's a process that everyone follows, and it's like there's a way to do it, and it's like A to B to B to C to whatever. And what I've realized is, like, some of the best companies with the most phenomenal outcomes for founders, like, never had to take on money, or like, had to bootstrap and had some really hard times early on, but really like nailed it. And over time, and over 10 years and 15 years, like that, those early tough days or tough times became very, very much worth it. So
I know. I cannot tell you the number of VCs that I've like gotten coffee with that are like openly admitting that raising money from venture capital is the worst way to fundraise. Like, they not all of them obviously, but several of them were like, go for government grants, go to the National Science Foundation, do it as much as you can for like non-dilutive funding before you come to us. And I mean, I'm actually interviewing for an SBIR grant right now. So I've made it through the first round, and there's only 2 rounds. So we'll see. But that is through the National Science Foundation. And that will be a good chunk of money. If you make it to the first phase, that will fundraise a lot. And it might actually delay our need to raise a pre-seed round for a few months, not that long. But that would be great because you don't give up any equity in the company. It's just the government taking an interest in what you do. And I would encourage anyone that is in sort of a technical field like this to look at the sources of funding like that before you go to VC. But at some point, if you aren't rich yourself, you need to raise money from somewhere and dilute your value in the company.
Yeah.
And the most accessible way to do that is venture capital, for good or for bad. And yeah, the lack of structure
because,
to it
I
is
mean,
interesting.
the lack of it's like you said, you pitch a deck, they have a little round table, and all of a sudden, 30 days later, millions of dollars hit your bank account. Like that's basically how it works.
So Karth, I know you have to go, but if you have 1 minute, has there been like a particularly fun story or like a wow, that was an incredible story?
I have 15 minutes.
Oh, you do? Okay.
I'm at 4:15 when I was.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Oh, amazing. So we have plenty of time.
Sorry, what was your question?
Is there like a particularly fun story or like interesting story that's happened to you on this crazy journey?
Gosh, I don't even know where to start. Yeah, I mean, I've had a couple. One of the most interesting things was there's this private equity investor from Israel that is looking to start his own venture capital fund. And he heard about what I was building. I still don't even know from whom because he wouldn't tell me. Just literally he didn't even email me. He sent me an invite to get coffee. And in the description for the event, the Google Calendar event, it was like, I'm a private equity investor from Israel. These are the things that I invest in. I'd love to chat. And it was so informative. Like, obviously, you take every opportunity to talk to anybody that could ultimately invest in you. But first of all, he was just a hilarious guy, which is what made it fun. But it gave me a good taste for what networking would actually look like, because this happened fairly early, that it's just going to be people that either hear about you or that you sort of just boldly approach and be like, hey, we're meeting, essentially. And what he and I talked about, he just gave me a lot of information about the industry and how competitive it is. I mean, healthcare data specifically, what the market potential for the idea would be, et cetera, et cetera. So there isn't much to the actual networking there, but in the sense that it gave me an idea for how ballsy I had to be, essentially, about networking through that process. It was nice. Overall, I would say the funnest part of all of this has been building our prototype and seeing it in action and like demoing it to people and seeing them sort of react and be like, whoa, this actually works. Now we're using like dummy data, but even then it's working on something. I think just that is very rewarding and in itself kind of fun.
Can you show us here? Is it possible to see?
Can't show it to you guys.
Okay.
Maybe soon though. But
We'll have to have a round two.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like fundraise. We'll have a round two. I'll have learnings from that too. But yeah, it's just really nice to see people's reaction. The other thing that's funny about it is to do a demo and to build a prototype, we had to build our own dummy electronic health record software. It's just a front end. It doesn't actually have data on the back end. But everyone sees it. They're like, can you just make this too? Because this looks a lot nicer and works a lot better than anything that we have, like Epic.
Pivot.
Yeah, it'd be nice. We actually have some ideas for ways to pivot and what to do with that. But it's pretty funny because EHR software is pretty awful universally, because there's basically a monopoly with this company Epic, which you guys might have heard of. And so it's sort of
Every
innovation.
hospital visit, if you look at the screen that they're using, like, and they're typing into what looks like a very antiquated system.
It looks so weird.
That's Epic.
Slightly teeing you up, but how was it meeting Andrew Yang? How was that?
Wow.
Interaction.
That's a left turn. It was nice. I mean,
Andrew Yang, I didn't even know that.
I did. So I went to like a VC happy hour that I was invited to by this company that was interested in Rising Tide. And I honestly didn't even know at first that Andrew Yang was going to speak there. But then they were like, okay, everyone, like Andrew Yang is here. And he gave like an awesome talk not about his political career. I mean, he talked a tiny bit here and there, alluded to it, but it was entirely about his work starting companies and what he's doing now. He's working on a new startup as well. And it was really illuminating because, I mean, he's just sort of a Renaissance man, right? Like he has so many interests in so many fields and is so similar to all of us. Like he's just like any of our friends that went to high school with us that just like are a little bit nerdy and like had an idea, and he just like did it. And I think that was really inspiring to me. And then afterwards, they just had a little meet and greet, and I happened to be sitting like in the second row, so I was like very quick to go up, and so I introduced myself and explained the company, and he was pretty interested in it because he was explaining that one of the things that he's trying to work on right now are ways to address things that are adjacent to income disparity. And this is it's the health disparity essentially, right? Like it's a disparity in health outcomes between different folks based on their access to clinical trials. So he was like immediately interested in it. We only really got like a minute to talk, but even that was nice because I was able to describe what I'm working on. He asked and I explained, and that was it. But I mean, to my earlier point about being sort of ballsy when it comes to networking, that's not in my nature, but I had to really learn that fast. And it pays off in situations like that. Now, nothing has really come of it yet because, I mean, he even said that he can't do meetings with new people until like later this quarter. But the goal is, for me to chat with him at some point.
You never know, man. You put a new thing into the world. You created one more connection. You never know when it'll come back. And
for sure.
I also wonder if, you know, what Mark Cuban has been working on. He always encourages people to cold email him. He's more in the taking drugs that are already out there and making it cheaper for people space, which is quite different. But he invests in tons of stuff.
I think this is like, yes, it is economically very different than what I'm working on, but it's in the same industry, right? I think he would have some interest in it. It actually has occurred to me to do something, to email him. I just haven't yet because I wanted something more concrete to back up what I'm saying with. And now we actually have a prototype, so it probably would. I have no idea if he would respond. Apparently he responds to a lot of people.
That's what I've heard.
So
we're going to cold email him first to get on the pod. So we'll tell you how that goes.
There you go.
And
if you're listening, this is the place to be.
By the way, I love the name and I love the website. Like, I don't know, how did you think of it? Rising Tide? Is that just the general feeling that you're having? Yeah.
It's not. So there's actually a term in clinical research called the rising tide problem, which is really a very simple concept. And I don't even know why it has its own name, but the idea is if you're running a study and the conditions at the site at which you're running a clinical research study improve, the outcomes of your study improve. It's kind of a very obscure idea, but also very simple to understand. Like if you're finding more patients at a particular hospital, which is the whole idea here, then the outcomes of your study improve. Or if you recruit better physicians to participate in the clinical trial as sponsors, then the outcome of the trial improves. Things like that. That's known as the rising tide problem, that it's hard to solve the infrastructure issue, essentially, of clinical trials and clinical research in order to better the outcomes of a study. So the point is that we are associating ourselves with solving that problem.
That's interesting, and such a good name, too.
One fewer syllable. It's 3 syllables total, like rising tide health, a rising tide. And then I debated as to whether to add help as a part of the title of the company or not, and I don't know what to do yet.
You know, piece of advice or whatever is like, I don't think names matter, especially in the early.
Yeah, I've heard this.
So don't sweat it.
It's not like a high priority per se.
Vivek is constantly trying to convince me of this because I'm like, let's dive right in. It's too long. And then we were thinking of other names, and then we ended up looking up Let's Dive Right In. We're like, we're the only people who made the name this long, and therefore if you search it, it's the only result.
Yeah.
It's the only result. So there's some weird benefits to having.
No, totally.
So
there is like there's like a surf shop in San Diego that is named Rising Tide. But other than that, there's like no company that's associated with healthcare that has this. So that was part of the reason why I chose it.
Famously, before it was called Stripe, the company was called /dev/payments, which in my mind, it's like, it's not a great name. It's like so difficult, but it doesn't matter. Like at the end of the day, if you guys get
the idea wins,
someone, if the idea
you can change it later. You can eventually rebrand.
You totally can. Yeah.
Dude, I'm so glad you came on though. It's been like, I don't think we've ever actually talked through all of this before. I don't think I've understood the scope of what you're working on. It's so
it's nice to explain it in like a non-investor environment too. Like I either am explaining it to like other founders or investors usually. So this is like a cool casual way to do it.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. I'm excited you came too. And I especially enjoyed in our conversation today some of the personal aspects, talking through like what is it like founding a company? It's scary, right? Like for most people, it's something that it's something most people will never do. And for those who do end up doing it, like it's always fascinating to hear what got them to do it. And actually, in another podcast we did with another Karthik Ramakrishnan, I don't know if you've met yet.
I did.
He's a VC, and he's in a different space altogether, but he was talking about vertical software, and he mentioned that like it's really he's really interested in that, mainly in the AI applications to vertical software, primarily because the founders that he meets are so, they've been in the weeds of that problem, and they know so much in depth about the space.
Yeah.
And so yeah, it's like this is kind of almost like case in point of that.
No, totally. There is one part of the personal journey I think I didn't mention earlier, which is I think you need to have an appropriate fear of failure. Like, it needs to create a sense of urgency in what you do. But if you fail, it shouldn't ruin you, if that makes sense. Like, that degree of fear should not exist for you. And if you're at a stage in life where it could, I think it would be too risky to jump into this. So like, when I was deciding to do this, I was like, if this just doesn't work out, what does this mean for us as a family? What does this mean for my career? And on both fronts, it was fine. Like, I'm not worried about this not working out if it doesn't work out. Obviously, I want it to work out, and I'm worried about it not working out in that context. But in terms of how it affects me in the long term, I'm not. Because for my career, I think this would be a great story to tell. It's a good founding journey. There are interesting lessons that I might be able to pull for a future job. And for my family, we made the calculation that this is a financial risk we could take for this period of time. But if you're not in that position, it makes it very difficult. If you can't take that leap and say, okay, I'm okay with failing right now, then it's going to be very hard to do. So I think that's like a key part of the personal journey that you need to sort of reckon with before you start to found something.
If some crazy investor or something asked you like, but don't you think that your motivation is lessened by not having this mentality of it's all or nothing? Is that just like a BS kind of mentality to go into something with, that you have to burn the ships?
I think so. There's this line that Obama used after he was president, where he said, he was asked in some interview about like, what are the things that he felt made him a good president? And he said he didn't need the presidency for himself. Like, he was an ambitious person. He recognizes he might even be an arrogant person, but he, I think rightfully, never seemed like someone for whom the presidency was all or nothing. And I think that might make a lot of sense, right? Like, it makes you a better operator in that role if you personally are not necessarily going to rise or fail with the thing that you're working on. It gives you kind of a freedom of mind to make certain choices for your business and make certain calculated risks that you otherwise might not have. And so I think you need to sort of wrestle with that yourself internally and be like, I really care about this problem. I really care about this company. Everything I'm doing day in and day out is dedicated to it. But if it doesn't succeed, it's okay. Like, I'm going to be okay. I think that's like a really, in my opinion, a healthy mentality to have before you enter it, and might even be a better mentality than the alternative.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for talking with us about this, Karthik, and sharing your journey and being so candid and open. It's obviously a really, really important piece of your life right now, and we want to hear more about it. So hopefully we do a round two sometime in the next few months, and we can hear what progress you've made.
Yeah, good luck.
All right, buddy.
Yeah.
All right, see you guys.
All right, guys.
Bye.
Bye.